G'day and welcome back to another TD42 episode. In the last episode, we went through the entire machining process and every step involved in taking an old TD42 block and dressing it up into something ready to be rebuilt. In front of me, I have two motors that will both be built to turbo spec. This one will be more of a factory turbo spec build, whereas this one will be more of a performance build. I've got a plethora of TD42 parts behind me that I'm very excited to get out of the boxes and show you guys what we're going to throw into these two motors. Along the way, we'll talk about some differences that you might find between the non-turbo and turbo motors, and also some considerations that you might want to make if you are looking at either turboing a non-turbo motor or looking at building a performance TD42 for yourself. So let's get into building these two motors. So in our last video, we went through the process of removing the camshaft bearings. So now what we're going to do is install our new camshaft bearings. Now without the genuine Nippon tool or something very similar, these can be a little difficult to align with the oil holes. So what I did was I used a marker and I marked the back side of the bearing, so the side that's being driven into the motor. I drew a reference line in line with the oil hole so that as you're knocking that bearing in, you can look from the top through the lifter holes and you can just catch a glimpse of that bearing as it's starting to be knocked into place. And if your oil hole is not lined up with that line, you got to stop before it's too late. If you get that bearing all the way in and the oil hole is not lined up, it's very difficult to get them out and you'll very likely damage that bearing beyond repair. I did also throw these bearings in the freezer to try and shrink them prior to installation, but I don't think it actually made a difference because the bearings are so small, they reach room temperature very quickly. Okay, so now that we've got our camshaft bearings installed, we're going to move on to installing our piston oil squirters or our piston oil cooling jets. Now technically in this motor they are oil cooling jets because they jet oil into the head of the piston. However, on other TDs they are just an oil squirter. So with the turbo squirters and your banjo bolts, I'll try and get it on camera here. You can see it's got that little opening just there. Down the guts of it there is actually a spring-loaded check valve. Just make sure you give that a good clean out, bit of brake clean and a bit of compressed air, and blow each of these out before you rebuild. Make sure that they're working properly. Alright, so oil squirters going in, a little bit of oil on the thread of the banjo bolt, and then torque them up to 29 to 39 Newton meters. And for the Performance TD42, we'll be using ACL Race Series bearings. You can see the part number there. These are a standard size bearing. They do come in multiple different sizes for oversize, and then they also have a 1 thou extra clearance option, which will just basically allow a little bit more float on your crankshaft. And I believe they also offer it for big ends on the rods. Now, I won't get into the science behind these bearings because quite frankly, I don't understand it, but the reason that you pay more for these race series bearings compared to other brands is because they are a higher quality and because they have additional coatings on the bearing surfaces, which makes them better than other brands. And for the factory build motor, Daido main and thrust bearings. So we've got the crankshaft in the Performance TD42. Now, both of the motors have had the crankshafts crack tested and polished by Oster's Engine Center in Caboolture. The Performance motor also went through a rotating assembly balance. So you send in the crankshaft with all your rods, pistons, your front balancer, and your clutch and flywheel assembly. Now, balancing the crankshaft and rotating assembly is really important on TD42s, especially if you're chasing a bit of extra power. We all know that the TDs like to snap cranks, so if we can try and reduce some of that excess vibration and harmonics that will basically go through this crankshaft, it gives us all the more chance to try and keep this thing in one piece. So if you've got all your parts there ready to go and a little bit of extra time and cash, I would definitely recommend sending it all in and getting it balanced by a professional. Okay, so now we're going to check our oil clearance, which is really important. Even though I've marked this crankshaft journals up as standard and I've got standard bearings in there, we still need to double check it. There is a way you can do this without the crankshaft. Basically, you throw all your main bearings and caps on, tighten everything up to torque, go through with a bore gauge, and you're just going to measure that diameter. Then you mic up the crankshaft and subtract the crankshaft journals from your main bearings, and that's basically your oil clearance. Not everyone has a bore gauge and not everyone knows how to use a bore gauge even if they had one. So what I'm going to use is ACL flexi gauge. It's basically a plasticine that you crush between your bearing and your crankshaft, and it's going to squash, and then you measure how much it's squashed, and that will tell you how much clearance is in your bearing and crankshaft. They come in sizes, so it's not one size can measure everything. You basically buy the flexi gauge in the diameter, and that diameter has a window, so this one will measure 1 to 3 thou, or in metric that is 25 micron to 76 micron. Alright, so we've got all of our main caps on with our bearings and plastic gauge in there. There's no lubrication in the top side of this, so you might have seen me lube up the bottom bearings. I then cleaned any of the crankshaft that we were putting plastic gauge on, and I didn't lube up the top main bearings. We're not going to spin the crankshaft while that plastic gauge is in there, and we need to go through in our specified torque sequence and do all of these main caps up, and then we're going to take them all off and inspect our plastic gauge. Now, I did leave out the thrust bearings on the top side. They just don't need to be in there for this step. We will put them in, and then we'll check our thrust forwards and backwards. Whew. Okay, so all those are torqued up now. So we can go through and back them off in the reverse order and inspect our plastic gauge. And to back them off, we'll be using this monster bar here. So here we have main cap number 1. You can see we have our squashed bit of plastic gauge in there. And the reason that they want you to go from one side of the bearing to the other is basically so you can get this gauge all the way up against the squashed plastic gauge. So you use the piece of paper as a scale or a reference. I'd say we're a little bit skinnier than that one, and maybe just a touch wider than that one. So I'm going to say we have about 0.076 clearance, which is well within our specs. When I torque these up, I like to go in a bit of a two-step process. So nip them up, get them snug down all the way, and then go through and torque them up to the final torque. The only thing with that is you need to stop far enough away from the final torque that you actually get a little bit of motion. If you kind of pull and it clicks without actually swinging, then you've not reached your final torque. You've allowed friction to kind of modify what the torque wrench is reading. So you need to allow enough room between your final torque that you get a little bit like this. If I pull on this now, so I need to back that off now and do that again. So what you're aiming for is snug, and then one continuous motion, click. And then we repeat that entire process for our standard engine using our Daido main bearings and checking our oil clearance. Okay, so main caps are all torqued up and our crankshaft spins beautifully. A little bit of resistance with that assembly lube, but that's nice. So with both of these motors, crankshafts being well used, while they are measuring up within spec, maybe come time for their next rebuild, they're gonna have to start looking at going to a different size of bearings as opposed to using standard bearings in these motors. Okay, so crankshaft end float. Hopefully you can see the dial indicator that I've got set up on the crank snout nice and clear. What you want to do is grab something like a flathead screwdriver that you can pry off of. We insert it between the main cap and the crankshaft and just pry back very gently. You don't need to put a whole lot of force into this. Then we'll zero the gauge, which I've already done. Then we're going to take our screwdriver and put it back in the other side of the main cap and crankshaft, and we're going to pry forwards. You'll see the dial indicator move. That's given me bang on 5 thou, which if we do a conversion, 5 thou comes out to 0.127 millimeter. So my Haynes manual only gives me a maximum limit of 0.4 millimeter. So I looked up the Nippon specs and it gives a standard crankshaft end play of 0.055 to 0.140 millimeters, which is 2.2 thou to 5.5 thou, which we are within. So now that our crankshafts have been installed into the block, we can move into installing our camshaft. To help with installation, I'd recommend using a long screwdriver or something similar to insert into the nose of the camshaft, and this will allow you to lever the rear of the camshaft up and guide it in through the bearings a little easier. After we put the camshaft in, you want to give it a bit of a spin and make sure that it's going to rotate freely. Following that, we're going to start assembling our pistons, rings and conrods. The performance engine will be receiving spool forged H-beam conrods to strengthen up the bottom end. Another quality option is the forged I-beam conrods available from Engines Australia. We'll be using ACL race big end bearings and Mahle pistons paired with Nippon rings that I'll speak a little bit more about soon. As for the standard motor, we'll be running factory turbo spec rods with NDC big end bearings, along with some factory style pre-topped pistons from Engine Australia with the same Nippon rings as the performance motor. Now that our pistons and rods are assembled, we're going to move on to our piston rings. Now before we install our piston rings onto our piston, we need to check our piston ring clearance. To do this, we install our rings into each cylinder and then take a feeler gauge and measure the gap. We also want to make sure that every piston ring is square when it's installed into the cylinder, as this will give the most accurate reading. Now, while you can buy tools specifically designed for squaring up piston rings in cylinders, you can also get away with using a piston to do the same. Now, for the standard engine, I'll be opening the ring gaps up to the upper limit of factory specs. This gives us room to increase power and boost later on if we desire. Now for the performance motor, we're going to be opening those gaps 1 to 2 thou beyond factory specs, because this motor is being built for more boost than what these specs are a guideline for. Now, oftentimes when you purchase performance pistons and rings, they'll come with an installation card or calculations specifying how much gap you should aim for depending on your power level, boost, and fuel type. Now, it's important to remember that it's better to be larger on your ring gap than it is to be smaller. If your gap is too small, you don't leave enough room for the piston rings to expand, and instead of expanding inwards, they'll begin to press into the cylinder wall where you'll get scoring or seizing of the bore. If your piston gap is too big, you can get lower compression, a bit more blow-by, and you might see yourself burning a little bit of oil. So I just thought I'd pause for a minute and talk to you guys about the pistons that are actually going into this performance motor. So they're a Mahle genuine style TD42 turbo piston. They're a genuine Japanese piston, and they're known for being very high quality compared to some of the other pistons that you can get. Mahle is one of the top names. Now, I bought these pistons uncoated, which is how you'd buy a majority of them, but more and more retailers are offering pre-coated pistons, so you can buy them direct from the suppliers already coated. So I took these pistons down to Competition Coatings in Brisbane, and they were able to coat all 6 of these pistons for around $500. Ceramic coating is becoming more and more affordable to everyday people that are building something sort of semi-performance. It used to be something really expensive that only racing teams were using, but now it is something that's quite accessible to most people, and it's something that I'll be doing on more and more of my motors. So you can see on the piston here, we've got 2 different colors, and that's 2 different types of ceramic coating. So the top side is a thermal barrier. It's designed to withstand a very high temperature and try and reduce the expansion in the crown of the piston. The crown is the area of the piston that will see the highest temperature, and so if we can try and keep some of that temperature out of the top of the piston and get it out into our exhaust, it'll keep the motor cooler and our pistons cooler. The blue that you see around the skirt is a dry film lubricant, and basically that's put there to try and reduce friction between the piston skirt and bore. You can actually use this to increase the diameter of the piston. If you have a piston that's run out of spec, or your bores are too large and you're just trying to gain a little bit extra on your pistons, you can get them to coat the skirt multiple times and increase the thickness. The ceramic coating is very hardy and it doesn't come off easily, and so it's a great way to repair something that was out of spec. But not only are you repairing it, at the same time you're upgrading that piston because the ceramic coating is superior to just a bare aluminium piston. So up in the underside of the piston there, you can see a purple color. Now that is the steel expansion control insert, and it's there to control thermal expansion of the piston. Now, while not all motors will use these, it's very likely if you're building a diesel motor, it will have these in the underside of the piston. And around our top compression ring, you can see a slight goldish color change in the piston. That is our Alphen insert, which is there to help prevent ringland wear and strengthen the ringland. Now, along with the Alphen over this side, you can see that there is a oil gallery. Now what that's going to do is receive the oil squirter from the turbo motor, and that's basically going to flush the whole upper side of the piston with oil, and that's going to assist with cooling the crown of the piston. With diesels, the head of the piston can get incredibly hot, especially if they're a performance motor. You're going to be pumping more and more heat into the crown, and if you don't have adequate cooling in the crown of the piston, that's when you start to melt them, or you'll damage the ringlands. So keeping the head of the piston cool is very important, and the turbo pistons basically achieve that by flushing the head with oil. Now, I don't have a non-turbo piston here to show you, but basically they'll look the same as this, but they will not have that oil gallery hole there, and there's no way for them to receive oil to cool the crown. They still have squirters which will flush the underside of the piston and try and sort of splash oil into the gudgeon pin there, but they don't have any sort of cooling galleries to try and keep the head of that piston cooler, and therefore you'll end up melting them. Now, very nearby to our oil gallery hole in the underside of the piston, we actually have a recess cut into the skirt. Now, that recess there is to fit our oil squirter nice and high up into the underside of the piston there, so that it can basically inject the crown. Now, along with those differences that we just mentioned about the piston and the crown with the oil cooling, the other difference we have between the NA and turbo motors is our oil squirters. So this is a NA squirter, this one is a turbo squirter. There's quite a large difference in size and length, and that's because one of these will go up into the piston crown. The other one basically just jets oil up around the underside of the piston. So there we have our oil gallery and our recess in the skirt, and our oil squirter is basically going to come all the way up in here, and it's going to flush the head of that piston with oil and try and wash heat out of the crown. The other difference that we see between NA versus turbo pistons, although both of them got this combustion bowl here, the NAs have 2 valve reliefs either side of that, whereas the turbo pistons did not get the valve reliefs. Now, both turbo and NA motors run the same big end size, so you can swap the rods between the motors. That will then allow you to run a 30mm pin with the turbo piston. Most turbo pistons are on a 30mm pin. However, some aftermarket companies are now making 28mm pin turbo pistons, which will allow you to use the NA rods with a turbo style piston. Now, because the turbo spec motors are using oil not only to lubricate the pistons but also cool them, and then they're also using that same oil to lubricate and cool the turbocharger, they're going to need to be able to move a high capacity of oil, which is why they run a slightly different oil pump. So you can actually measure these and visually tell them apart. So you can see that the turbo spec is actually recessed into the housing because the gears are so tall, whereas the NAs kind of just sit on top of that housing there. You can also measure the gear sets. So I measured the turbo spec at 21mm and the NA spec at 18mm. And supposedly the turbo spec moves about 25% more oil volume. Now, with all that said and done, obviously, yes, you can still throw a turbocharger on an NA TD42 and it's going to run pretty happy. People have been doing it for a really long time, getting lots of Ks out of it while abusing them. And they do hold up pretty well, but eventually it will die, and it's very likely that some of the reasons are because of inadequate oil and cooling, which is why I'm making these changes to this motor behind me, because I want it to be quite happy and reliable with a little bit of boost pumped into it. All right, so now I'm done yapping. I'm going to get back to assembling this motor. If there's anything that I got incorrect, let me know in the comments below and correct me so that everyone else can learn. And at the same time, if I left anything out or you've got some useful information about these motors, go ahead and share it and we can all learn a thing or two. Okay, so I've just finished measuring all of our ring clearances and we're getting ready to put our pistons and rods together. I just thought I'd talk about the direction when we assemble these. So with our pistons, when we're standing behind the motor looking towards the front, so on the top of our piston you can see we've got our little fuel ramp or swirl chamber on the top, and that will face towards the front of the motor. And then up the guts of it, we've got our little oil squirter hole. So this will be on the right side of the motor. And then on our rod, we've got our bearing tangs there. Now they will go to the left side of the motor, so the camshaft side. And when you put them together, it'll look like that. So tangs on the left, fuel ramp on the right. Okay, so a quick run through on what I found worked for installing pistons into the TD. So to begin with, I'll rotate the cranks so that whichever cylinder I'm installing into, the cranks are bottom dead center. I'll then take my piston ring compressor and rod, and I'll install it into the cylinder. It really helps out if you leave a little bit of skirt hanging out the bottom of the ring compressor. Helps you line it up, keep everything square, and you avoid clashing the skirt on installation. I'll then line up this fuel ramp here in the top of the piston with a little coolant hole in the deck. Every single cylinder has one that lines up just about perfect. It's a really good way to line up the pistons for install, and it avoids you hitting the rods on either your oil squirter or the crank counterweights on the way down. So now that this is lined up, I'll give it a couple quick taps with the hammer until the piston has left the ring compressor. So once the piston has left the ring compressing tool, we're going to press it in the rest of the way by hand, and we're going to use our other hand to go underneath the crank and guide the big end over the crank journal. Make sure our rod bolts aren't going to hit our counterweight or our crank journal. Even though we're pressing it in by hand, you can still do a little bit of damage doing that. So you want to make sure that that big end bearing lands exactly where it needs to be on that crank journal. Quick tip, if you're going to purchase a ring compressor that's this style, see if you can find one that has dimples in the outer sheet. They'll interfere with the block deck and prevent the tool from being dragged down when you're installing pistons. We also want to double check that our piston rings are correct before they go into the compression tool, because it's the last time you're going to see them. So we want to double check that they're facing the right direction, up or down. Most manufacturers have a different way of doing this, but these are Nippon rings, so they have a little N on the upside that you can probably see on that one there. So double check that you've got them facing the right way up and down. And we also want to double check that our piston rings are not aligned. So if you align your piston rings up like that, you're just going to blow compression gas straight down the side of the piston. Now, rod caps are 78 to 83 Newton meters, which is roughly 60 foot-pound. These do need to be lubricated before torquing, and you want to do them same as our main caps. Don't just go straight to torque on one side and then leave the other side loose. You want to do them up bit by bit, get them pretty close, and then follow through. So this is ARP Ultra Torque. It's a lubrication for ARP hardware. So anytime that you're using ARP fasteners in your motor, you're meant to use this lubrication in order to replicate the torque figures specified by ARP. So the spool rods we're using are a forged rod using ARP 2000 fasteners. You can get them with ARP L19 fasteners, which are a different material with different torque specifications, but they are able to achieve a higher clamping force. They are a stretch bolt, whereas the 2000s aren't, which make them a little bit easier to use. So factory torque specs for the Conrod nuts on the factory rods are 78 to 83 Newton meters, whereas using these ARP 2000 bolts, we're able to torque them up to 100 Newton meters. So we've got the first rod cap off, and you can see from the flexi gauge there, we've got quite a nice squish. When we compare that to what I saw on my main caps, which my crank journals were on the sort of upper end of their wear limit, so they had a bit more oil clearance, we got less squish, and we got a thinner line compared to what we've got here. So without even measuring yet, I know that this is going to be a much tighter clearance compared to my main caps. And that to me looks like 0.038 millimeter. Oil clearance specs on the Conrod big end is 0.035 to 0.081, and oil clearance specs on the mains is 0.35 to 0.87. So we're just getting ready to throw this oil pump onto the factory motor. It's reusing a turbo spec pump. The performance motor has received the exact same thing, but brand new. We're just gonna mic this up to ensure that it's not got excessive wear. So what we're gonna do is measure underneath the gears against the housing and ensure that there's not too much clearance underneath there. We're gonna check the backlash of our gears, and then we're also going to check this shaft diameter, which goes directly into the block, and there's a bush inside the block. We want to ensure that there's not too much play between any of these moving parts to ensure that it will pump oil effectively. So for our backlash, we want to ensure that there's no more than 0.43 millimeter of backlash. And then for our shaft diameter to our bush. We want to make sure that there's no more than 0.15 millimeter of clearance. And then for our gear to housing clearance, which it's quite hard to do, but you have to get a feeler blade underneath the gear there and in between the housing. You want to ensure that there's no more than 0.16 mil of clearance underneath those gears. So now that we've mic'd up this pump and it's within specs, we know that it's going to perform correctly and we're safe to use it again. So we finally got the oil pump onto the block. The O-ring was giving me a bit of grief because it'd been in the gasket bag all scrunched up and didn't want to sit in the groove behind the oil pump. If you're having that same issue, go boil the jug, put the O-ring into a cup of hot water, have a cup of tea and settle down while you wait. And then try again, put a little bit of grease on the O-ring as well to try and help it sort of tack into the O-ring groove. So that sorted me out long enough to fit the pump to the block. So now we're going to go through the torque sequence, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And these are torqued up to 13 to 19 Newton meters. Alright, so we pretty much have 2 assembled short blocks right here. Now we're going to begin the process of installing our timing gear. Okay, so we're getting ready to put our backing plates onto the TDs. Both TDs are receiving a Stone branded backing plate gasket, which is a good quality gasket. Now I have done a bit of looking around on whether or not to use sealant along with these gaskets. The Nippon manual doesn't state to use any gasket maker, RTV or otherwise. So after doing a bit of digging around online and talking to Dad about whether or not to use RTV behind this, he recommended that we can use Permatex Aviation former gasket, which you can use to dress or fortify paper and cork gaskets. It is a gasket maker, but it's very, very thin and you should only use it on machine surface as opposed to like an RTV that you can use to fill gaps that are a little bit larger. So what we're going to do is use a bit of this Permatex to dress the gaskets, and that will improve the seal behind our backing plate. Okay, so both backing plates are on. I did touch up a little bit of paint around this area here behind the water pump because you can get a little bit of corrosion here, and I didn't want to leave it bare. Something I should have done before I put the backing plate on, but better late than never. And then the other thing I noticed after installing the backing plate is you don't really need to put as much gasket maker through the center as I did. It's mainly just around the edges and around these 2 coolant jackets here that we want to seal. So cracking into our timing, we've got our idler gear bush. My manual states that the oil hole has to be at the top. You can actually install this either direction, but we're going to follow the manual, oil hole to the top. And we've got a little bit of assembly lube on that to make sure it's going to spin nice. Torque settings for these 2 idler gear bolts is 25 to 35 Newton meters. Now for our camshaft gear. And for the camshaft retaining bolt and washer, 78 to 88 Newton meters. And I've put a little bit of blue Loctite on there because this shaft does rotate. So timing the TD is pretty straightforward once you find the timing marks. They are quite small. So on the crankshaft we have a single dot at the top there, and then on the idler we've got 2 dots that need to be either side of that. If you follow it around, we've got a Z, and that's where the fuel pump lines up, and the fuel pump gear has a matching ZZ, and you want them either side of the idler gear Z. If we follow the idler gear around to the camshaft, it's got a single dot. You line that up with the 2 dots on the camshaft, The 2 dots need to be either side of the single dot, and then the oil pump is not timed, and if you've got a vac pump on the timing case, it's also not timed. Alright, so that's the bottom end of our TD42 fully assembled. We're at the stage of what's commonly referred to as a short block, although a short block doesn't always include your timing gears. I just thought it would be a good way to round out this episode. Now, at the time of filming, I did intend to do this as one whole video from bare block all the way up to a fully dressed motor, but with the amount of information that I want to keep in this video, it would have been ridiculously long. So what we're going to do is split this episode in two, so going from a bare block to a short block, and then in our next assembly episode, we'll go from a short block to a fully dressed TD42. Now, I would have filmed this outro in front of my 2 engines, but they are almost fully dressed, and I didn't want to give away some of the parts that I'll be revealing in the next episode. What I can do is show you guys a little bit of progress that I've made on the GU. Sadly, no progress to show you guys on the D22. I know a lot of people have been asking about it and what happened to it, where it is. It's still right here. I still intend on finishing it. I just need to get my daily back on the road first. So this is the progress that we've made on the GU. The motor's out, it's just about fully stripped, ready to receive a brand new TD42. So what I need to do is get back into the shed and finish that engine so that we can get this car running again. All right, so we're gonna wrap the episode up here. Like I said earlier, I'm not perfect, I do make mistakes. If I've missed any important information or got anything incorrect, get into the comments below, fix it up so that we can all learn a thing or two from this video. If you guys have made it all the way to the end of the episode, thanks very much for watching. I hope you got some useful information out of it and enjoyed it. All right, so that's all I've got for this episode. I'll see you guys in the next one.